Oh, so how long have you actually been in the world of ELT? And his answer was forever. So he's been in the world of ELT forever. He's the author of Eyes Open, and he's also written two wonderful handbooks called Working with Images and Language Learning with Digital Video. He's a dog lover, and I'm trying to give you a little bit of information that we don't already have in the program. And he's a dog lover, and he lives in a beautiful little village on the Costa Brava. And today he's going to be talking to us about labels. So, oh, and one I nearly forgot. We're being live streamed. So, as we're doing with all the other plenaries, can you turn to the cameras and wave to everybody who's watching from around the world? Okay, wonderful. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Ben.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Andrea. Thank you very much for coming after lunch. I know it's a difficult slot. First, before I start, I want to thank Cambridge University Press for sponsoring me to be here, and I want to thank APPI for inviting me in the first place. It's my first time, in spite of living in Spain for over 25 years. I've never come to the APPI Conference. It's very nice to be here. And I have to say, it's an extremely well-organized conference, one of the best I've been to, and I've been lucky enough to travel around the world doing this job. So I think we should give a round of applause to the APPI organizers. Okay, I'm going to be talking about labels today, and the labels we live by. It's looking at the way that we increasingly categorize and label different elements in our profession, both ourselves, our students, and language itself. And I'm going to begin with a little anecdote. I used to work here in Granada. You know where that is? In the south of Spain, in Andalusia. And I arrived in my first year I lived in Madrid, and then in 1992 I moved to Granada, and I worked in this lovely place. This is a patio renacentista. It's like an old Renaissance palace that became the Centro de Lenguas Modernas de la Universidad de Granada. And I was there when it opened, and that was my job for 11 years. I worked in this language school, teaching university students. When I arrived, very young, very green, in 1992, I'd only been teaching a very short time. We had lots of students interested. The center had just opened, and loads of students were interested in enrolling on the course. And we had all the university students and people from the general public. And my director of studies then said to me, well, Ben, it's really difficult. We're going to get hundreds of students, and we need to put them in levels. We need to categorize them according to level. And that can take a long time, and you're not very experienced, so let me give you a tip. He said to me, ask them a question in the present perfect, something like, how long have you studied English? If they answer something like 2 years, that's intermediate. If they say, since 3 years ago, or something, or they say, I study since 2 years ago, that's pre-intermediate. I thought, you mean just knowing that tense is enough to label a student, to label them according to their proficiency level? He said, yeah, you'll find that most students can't. So we have what we call a nivel granadino, which is level 3, pre-intermediate. And it was true. This was it's crazy to think about it, but that was the technique we used for categorizing students according to proficiency, whether they knew the present perfect or not. And of course, it's not as simple as that, is it? Yeah? I was finding that there were students arriving for the level tests, and they were speaking incredibly fluently because maybe they'd been to the United States or somewhere on a year off, or maybe they just had more speaking skills than they did really badly on the grammar. They had no control of the present perfect, but they were really fluent. I said, what do you do with these misfits? And he said, just put them in level 3, they'll be fine. And I thought, there's something wrong here. So we'll go back to that later. We'll come back to that. But that was my first experience of labels. That's the first learner label that you almost encounter when you start teaching. Isn't it? Elementary, beginner, pre-intermediate. Those are the first labels when you begin this profession. I'm going to show you some other common labels here. Okay? I'm sure you recognize them. Just with the person next to you, I want you to tell me, what is the criterion that's been used It's not a trick question, okay? It should be an easy question for you. What's the criteria that's been used to get this label, all right? Just for the person next to you, 2 minutes. I think you should find it quite easy. You finished? No? I'm going to do the classic international house thing. You know this one? I put my hand up and you will put your hand up and shut up. Yeah. Hopefully. So third year is, what's the third year? The time that's spent on a course. Not necessarily the level, is it? It's the amount of time. You spent 1 year, the first year. False beginner. False beginner. Again, it's not a trick question, not yet. What's false beginner? Yeah, proficiency, right? Like intermediate. But false beginner, have you ever stopped to think about that label? Isn't it an awful label? A false beginner sounds worse than a real beginner. It is kind of worse, isn't it? Why is it worse? Because they're kind of failed. They're stuck somewhere between beginner and intermediate. Very unhelpful label, I think. The word false has so many negative connotations, doesn't it? So why do we use that? Falso principiante. You say, I'm sure, something similar in Portuguese, right? ESL student. ESL, English as a second language. This is the context that you're in. So if you're in the United States, you're studying in the United States, and you're surrounded by English, then that's... But is that problematic these days, that label? Possibly. Because there are some countries in the world now where the level of English is so high, thinking about countries like Scandinavian countries, Israel, Singapore, where English is a second language. Therefore, you're so much surrounded by English that you could call that actually, they're not officially countries which English has that status, but because of globalization, if you go and live in Denmark or Iceland, you would probably consider that an ESL context these days. Near native. Yeah, I'm not going to go into huge detail about this. Is a talk on its own, just analyzing that label. But the near native could be proficiency, but it normally is referred to birthplace. Near native, again, is that a nice label? No. I mean, it's got a lot of negative connotations. The native, non-native label, there's been a lot of talk about this recently, this deficit label, yeah. So you're not a native. It has a very negative association. Again, near native, yeah, almost but not quite, yeah? It's like saying, almost, you're almost native. Sorry, not quite. Visual, yeah, this is, what's a visual learner? It's their learning style, yeah? We'll come on to that in a moment. And the introvert is the personality. Are these labels complicated? What I'm going to suggest in this talk is that these labels are labels we use all the time without thinking, but in fact they have a lot of weight. And in fact, some of them can be quite unhelpful, quite counterproductive. These are all different labels for learners. But let me just look at a couple of them and show you how complicated these are and unpack them. But before we do that, I think there's an increasing tendency these days to label ourselves. Jo, yesterday in her plenary at exactly the same yesterday was talking about how we're all addicted to screens and Facebook and social media, and we spend hours. I'm sure you've seen on Facebook these kind of tests popping up, yeah? You know, what character are you? You know, what Harry Potter character are you? Or, yeah? And there's a thing called all the tests where you can, you know, very, very, very quickly answering some entertaining questions, you can find out who you are, and then you share that information with everybody else. How many people is the same as me, yeah? I'm sure you've done those tests, yeah? Some of you are nodding anyway. And there are many. There are some silly ones, the funny ones, like, you know, what Harry Potter character are you? Or what, you know, what country are you? Or anything like that. But of course, what learner type are you as well? And all these very convenient labels are thrown out, yeah? Find out what type of learner you are according to so-and-so scale. But of course, it's not so, as simple as that. And look at what's always interesting is looking at the comments. This is something Joe did yesterday as well. That when you look at these sites, what's so interesting is how people interact with them, with these tools, these games, in this case, these tests. And they say, yeah, great infographic. You know, I really enjoy it, but I can't find myself. Perhaps slightly innocent person thinking that this test would categorize them accurately. I talk a lot, learn by reading, can learn in a noisy environment, even while listening to music, and always sitting in the back. What type of learner am I? Yeah. So somehow he doesn't fit, James doesn't fit, and is worried that he hasn't fitted into the category that has been established for him. Looking at those categories we saw before, probably the most controversial one is the learning styles one, and the one that has been recently, I don't know if you know this, but has been has been critiqued a lot in English language teaching conferences and has largely been discredited. A couple of years ago, IATEFL, Carol Letherby did a conference on this topic. She showed some research from Mexico where she showed this statement to the teachers: individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. What do you reckon was the percentage of teachers that agreed with that statement? I mean, this is in Mexico, but you probably don't know, but Mexico culture, but it was 95% of approximately 150 teachers surveyed in Mexico agreed with this statement. So there's a kind of, it's very embedded, it's very ingrained, this idea. Why has it become so ingrained? There is now an incredible amount of writing and analysis of this to discredit it completely. And we have seen the El Gazette from exactly a year ago, and I think this is true that Cambridge English have now pledged to remove the phrase from their Celta and Delta syllabus. This is the beginning. They've actually replaced learning styles with learning preferences, which I think is better, but perhaps isn't the answer. But learning styles has now been taken out of those two teacher qualifications. So they're starting to have an impact on our profession. I'm going to give you a little task to do. I'm going to show you those labels I showed you before, third year and near native. Those labels are ones that you have encountered before, yeah? You're familiar with those labels. Here are 3 other labels for learners that you might not have encountered before. I want you to tell me, where do these labels come from? Can you guess? And what do they refer to? And do they sound positive or negative? So you've got 3 labels here. Tourist. All of these exist. All of these are labels to describe learners. All right? So tourist level. ELF, not EFL. ELF, yeah? User. The word user, not speaker. That's interesting. And long-term English learner. Just with the person next to you, could you just discuss that? Those 3 labels? Just a couple of minutes. Should work. It doesn't work. I think no one's looking at me. OK, so let's have a look at these. Tourist. Does it sound, well, first of all, is it positive or negative? You've been in a situation, haven't you, where you've been in another country, I don't know, you go to Germany or somewhere and you know a few words. I have a German-sounding name, so I go to Germany and they go, Herr Goldstein, and I walk into the hotel, they're expecting me to speak fluent German, and I don't speak German at all. I feel like an idiot. And we've all felt like that, haven't we? That's what I thought when I saw that label tourist. Tourist level is like you can ask for a coffee and that's about it, you know. And let's have a look at that tourist. There's a tourist there. And if you get any of those in Aveiro, This is the definition of the tourist level, the definition. And that might give you a clue, if you're really clever. In fact, occasionally there's a really clever person in the audience who knows that this level exists and actually is able to tell me exactly where it's from. I don't know if there's anyone here. But if you are aware of the style in which these things are written, you might know what this context. Let's look at this. Relies purely on a very finite, rehearsed, lexically organized repertoire of situation-specific phrases. Something like, uma cerveja, por favor. Yeah? Can you guess who wrote that, or what organization wrote that from the style in which it's written? What do you reckon? Is there any clever clogs that knows? It's the Council of Europe. It's the Common European Framework, yeah? But it's the Common European Framework below A1. Yeah, you didn't realize there was anything below A1, where there is. Those people really don't know anything. Yeah, well, they know. Actually, I think that sounds quite good. And that's the other interesting thing about these labels. The definition relies purely, that's a negative, purely, on a very finite, rehearsed, lexically organized, well, actually, you know, we've got enough of those repertoire of phrases. That doesn't sound so bad to me. But the label itself, the name they gave to that label is so negative. Tourist, you're a tourist. It's a very pejorative association. If you look at the Common European, you know that blue book that you know, I kept it under the bed for a few years. It's not exactly bedtime reading, but it's very friendly, isn't it? But it's there. That level is there. But no one talks about that level. And why don't they talk about it? Because no one teaches at that level. Until recently, where an organization that will remain nameless, a big organization, have created a scale of numbers from 10 to 90. This is a new category, a new form of labeling proficiency. Instead of using A1, A2, and all the variations, they've taken the Common European Framework here, okay, and they've taken from the 6 levels of the Common European Framework, they've created 9 numerical levels, from 10 right through to 91. And the very lowest one is the tourist level. It's below A1. So the level existed. It's just that nobody bothered before to use it. And interestingly, you know, it's a very, according to their scale, this is called the global scale of English. According to this scale, well, you can't do very much. All you can do is recognize numbers up to 10 and write a short, simple postcard. Speaking and listening, not applicable. That means you can't say or understand anything. Well, I'm not going to go into who created this scale and why they created it. You can do that yourself at home. But for me, this is something inherently negative for our profession, because you're creating more scales, more labels, and what's the reason? To sell more products. Yeah, we didn't, you know, 6 levels, fine. 6 levels have always been fine for us. Before they were called elementary, pre-intermediate, do you remember? Now they're called A1, A2. Okay, you might have B1 plus. But do we need 9? I don't think so. Anyway. ELF users, ELF is, I don't know if anyone was in Robin Walker's talk yesterday. Anyone in Robin Walker's talk about pronunciation? He was talking about ELF. What is ELF? English as a lingua franca, yeah. People think it EFL, ELF, so English as a foreign language, English as a language foreign. No. It's English as a lingua franca. And what's English as a lingua franca? Well, it's the language, yeah, and there's too many of you. If this was a workshop, you could have a great time, but this is scary. English as a lingua franca is the language that we share, isn't it? In international contexts, it's the language we have in common. It may be lots of different speakers, a German, you know, a Swiss person, an Argentinian, a Portuguese person, all in a meeting somewhere in Tokyo, and the language they're speaking is English, because that's the language they have in common, the lingua franca. And an ELF user, this is a category, this label exists, is this. And this is Jennifer Jenkins. I don't know if you know who she is. She says ELF users draw on their bilingual or plurilingual resources in order to project cultural identity signal solidarity with an interlocutor, and prioritize communicative efficiency over correct. Are you still awake? Yeah. What kind of category is this? You can look at the language that's used to describe it. It's, who is Jennifer Jenkins, do you think? She's an academic. Yeah? She works in a university. This is an academic category. But there are millions and millions and millions of ELF users. You yourselves are ELF users, could be, potentially. That's what the world exists. The world, it's a fantastic phenomenon. It's happened because of globalization, because the status of English is changing and so on, because we all live and travel in a different way than we did before. But do we need the category? Does anyone want to be an ELF user? No, I don't think so. You don't aspire to be, you don't say to your students, oh, let's all be ELF users. This is a category which is a positive category. It's really interesting. It's all about not having to sound too English, sounding yourself, sounding like a Portuguese person in order to project something of your cultural identity. But we don't aspire to being this. This is a category that's only really of interest to academics. But the person itself, these people, are everywhere. Yeah? They are simply successful users of the language. So from my point of view, that category, ELF user, is not necessary for us. But user, and the difference between user and speaker, now that is an interesting difference, and a very important difference. Look at someone very intelligent, much more intelligent than me, Diana Larson-Freeman. Look what she says, the difference between user and learner. She says, a language is not a commodity to be acquired once and for all. I love that image. Language is not something you just put in your pocket. That's a commodity. But an endlessly emergent, dynamic system being shaped and reshaped by all who use it. Isn't that a wonderful idea? That's what language is about. We all know that as language teachers, don't we? That language is always in constant flux. You keep learning your mother tongue. You're constantly learning and unlearning, relearning. It's a dynamic system. So for me, that label, user-learner, that's a really important label. And that does indicate a big difference. And you'll hear this word user used much more often now because of this. OK. And the other thing she goes on to say, if you're interested, I like also this concept of the difference between learner development instead of acquisition. Instead of acquisition, you own something. You're the learner, and that's the end point of the process. Development suggests you never stop learning. And the development avoids the commodification of language and the presumption of an endpoint. So for me, some labels are really important. And I think if there's one label that's important, it's this one. It fundamentally, isn't it fundamentally different and useful for us? And the last one, this one, does that sound bad? Or? Sounds really bad, doesn't it? Long term. Long term. OK. I wonder if you can guess where this comes from. Well, in fact, it's quite easy. Enrolled in any of grades to the United States for more than 6 years and remained the same English proficiency for 2 or more consecutive determined by the English language development test, identified developed pursuant to section 6C, 8, 10, or any successive test of scores far below basic or below basic. It's the California Education Code section. And it classifies students who have not passed the tests. The problem with these tests is that these tests have been designed for native speakers, not for plurilingual speakers or bilingual speakers. And so what's happening is that there are students who are perhaps bilingual, in fact, perhaps lack literacy skills, but are being classified as failures in English language because the test doesn't accurately evaluate their proficiency. And this long-term English learner is an extremely stigmatizing label. So the problem with some labels is that they stigmatize. Yeah? They make those people somehow, yeah, we don't want to be one of those. So labels are not innocent. Labels are extremely powerful. And I got really into the whole thing about labeling, and I read this book, which is really hard to read, but I found a quite interesting quotation from it. It says here that there is a moral agenda for each standard and category valorizes some point of view and silences another. Yeah? So by your long-term English learner is always weighted against the learner who is able to pass the tests, who does well. Yeah? Labeling the labels then. How do we label it? We look at those three labels. We can see the tourist one. That comes from the Common European Framework. That comes from an education context. Educational authority has a negative connotation because it's below A1. Previously ignored, but has now new impact because of this global scale that I mentioned. The ELF user is an academic category. It's positive, perhaps limited impact, specific to, very specific to an academic context. And the last one, long-term English learner, is a social marker, very negative, great impact, a label which has great impact on society and stigmatizing. And so stigmatizing that, in fact, there's a bit of confusion about these labels. Long-term English learner, also the whole label EL and ELL. What has been very interesting is that in communities, for example, like California, where there's or Texas, Nevada, where there's a large number of bilingual, Latin American families, what's happening is that certain families, certain children are being labeled incorrectly, just because they have, their father might be called Martinez or something, yeah? In other words, their actual language level is similar or very similar proficiency level to other classmates, but they're being stigmatized with this label. Let me show you this short news report. Don't worry, it gets happier later, okay, this talk. But I want to show you the power, the negative of power of labels before I offer you an alternative to them. And see how I was very shocked when I saw this report. This comes from Canada and showing the impact of these negative labels on kids at school. Vancouver students falsely labeled English language learners.
There are calls tonight for an investigation into a Vancouver school. It comes amid allegations that the number of ESL students has been falsely inflated. CBC News has learned that some parents suspected that their children were being labeled English as a second language when only English was spoken in the home. Erick Rankin from our investigative unit went looking for answers.
So what do you want to do at the park, babe?
Swimming! Sarah Perrin doesn't want us to show her 5-year-old's face to keep her out of the spotlight, but she does want you to hear Christina's language skills.
My name is Snow White, and I'm going to the park today.
Yet since Christina entered kindergarten in September, Sir Sanford Fleming Elementary School has falsely claimed her as an ELL student, needing English language learning, the new name for ESL. Perrin suspects it's because Christina has her Mexican father's last name.
Well, I feel it's a racial profiling for funding.
And little Christina isn't the only native English speaker falsely labeled ELL at Sir Sanford Fleming. CBC News has learned her entire kindergarten class, all 20 pupils, were designated ELL.
I felt it was an extremely huge waste of resources, as English is our first language.
The more ELL students in a school, the more taxpayers' dollars it gets. BC's Education Ministry pays over $1,000 for each ELL pupil for up to 5 years. Money that goes back to the school for extra staff and resources. This Vancouver...
Okay, so that's enough, right? I mean, it could not be more horrible, could it? Mislabeling students, so stigmatizing with the label and incorrect in order to get more funding. But don't worry, it does get happier. The second half is a bit more upbeat. So what's the problem with some labels? Well, they're very value-laden. Labels are value-laden, yeah? Near-native, long-term learner, false beginner, tourist. These are such negative labels, but have we ever stopped to think? The non-native one, that one gets a lot of press, sure, and rightly so because of its deficit characteristic. But do we stop to think about the negative connotations of labels in general? They're stigmatizing, bureaucratic, limiting, imprecise, and very importantly, self-fulfilling. Have you ever heard of the Pygmalion effect? Yeah? The Pygmalion. Some of you. This idea is kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, maybe you start a new course next year and the previous teacher says to you, oh, this course, these guys are brilliant. You'll have absolutely no trouble. They're really good. They're really motivated. And what happens? That's exactly what they are. Yeah. In other words, and the same in negative. This class is really terrible. They have such problems. They have discipline problems. And that is what happens. In other words, that the research shows that positive or negative expectations will influence positively or negatively. Article from the Times Education Supplement says when we label students by ability, we limit their potential to learn. We've got to label them somehow, but it's quite clear that if it's only by ability, if it's only by proficiency, you know, A, B, C, or D, whatever you want to classify, however you want to classify your learner, then this is going to be pejorative. It's going to have a negative effect. And this is the text I'd like you to read from that. And I wonder, as you read that text, I'll just drink some water. While you read that, I wonder if you can think of a student or even yourself when you read that. If it makes you think of a context or a person you're familiar with. Does that ring a bell? Yeah. Yeah. I work on an online MA program in the New School in New York. Unfortunately, it's all online, so I never go to New York. And I don't like stereotyping, but my students are completely obsessed with grades. Completely. And they all want really high grades. They're not that concerned about my comments. The majority of them say, but why did I get an A minus? So A minus is a good grade. So, yeah, but it's not an A. You know, there's this kind of obsession with grade. The fixation on the grade is something that is a real problem. So it was the case that her percentage mark equaled a C grade. And for Sam, this underwrote a lifetime of being labeled a C person. But we're beginning to do something different now. Can you notice this is a little bit different? And this is where I'm going to suggest an alternative to labeling. Can you see that this is a story? Yeah. We're describing this person's profile, the history of this person's education, and the consequences of that, and the result that she labels herself always as a C person. And this is the kind of approach, we'll talk about it more later, but this is the approach that I think is the affective approach. So to try and connect with effective and affective, which is the theme of the conference, I would like to suggest that very often labels come from our desire to be efficient, yeah? To create a method or to create a system that will work. But very often, in that desire to be efficient, we're forgetting the human touch, which is the affective. And so clearly, as soon as you begin to talk about an individual student and their characteristics, you're getting into questions of affect, aren't you? And you're beginning to see that there is a story and a reason for this person to be the way they are. Okay, one more label that I think is very fun. Before we start talking about opposite to labeling, you won't guess this one, but can you guess what EN means? English? Yeah. English 5. You think 5 is high or low? It's in the middle there. EN5. User, again, is the label. Let me explain what this label is. It's fascinating. And this is the definition. EN5, the other way of describing it is professional, so it's very positive. This user is able to communicate with a professional level of English, whatever that means. Yeah. I mean, unpacking labels is fascinating. What does professional mean? Anyway, the context, I guess no one would know, but it's fascinating, comes from Wikipedia. Has anybody here ever contributed anything to Wikipedia? No? Put your hand up if you, I mean, some people do. That's the whole point about Wikipedia. It's collaborative. No? Well, nor have I, but I found this label by accident. And when you contribute something to Wikipedia, you can categorize your level of English. Obviously, you may do it in another language, of course. Wikipedia is plurilingual. But of course, many people contributing to Wikipedia are using the lingua franca, using English. And I found this incredible, you don't need to read this, but I found this incredible debate in Wikipedia about these labels and about the way that they categorize. And the debate is exactly the same as the debate we're having, or similar to the debate we're having in ELT about native and near native. It's really, really interesting. How is near native different from the advanced? I feel this template is more useful for those who aren't actually native speakers. And they're all arguing, debating these labels, and trying to debate what is the best category for them in the context of Wikipedia. I'll just tell you what the categories are. These are the ones. There's EN1, and it's interesting that they borrow the labels from language teaching. Yeah? So intermediate. These very vague labels, we kind of know what they mean. But we've got basic, EN1, all right, so that's not very good. We've got intermediate, which is EN2, and we have advanced, which is EN3. So it turns out that EN5 is really quite high. There you go. EN4, near native. See, it appears, yeah, almost. Professional is better than near native. It's just mental. And then, of course, number one is God, the native speaker. Doesn't even have a number. It's N. Supremacy of the native speaker, even in Wikipedia. But like everything in the world of the internet, you can make up your own category. You can subvert the category. And look at this person. He said, my level is EN 4.5. This non-native user is able to contribute with an advanced level of English equal to or surpassing most natives. So, being inherently democratic, the internet allows you to create your own category. But isn't it crazy? All these categories when we don't really need categories. A short parenthesis. I said at the beginning, we've been focusing a little bit on learners, haven't we? Proficiency. But I want to talk also about labels on language and labels for teachers. These words, according to the global scale of English I mentioned earlier, these words are labeled with a level from the Common European Framework. What do you reckon is their label, these adjectives? You don't need to be an expert in the Common European Framework, but what do you reckon? B1? A1? B2? I know, it's a bit intimidating, isn't it, this room, to say anything. OK, so according to the global scale, these are the categories, B2 and C1. But for any Romance learner, any Romance language learner, they're not B2 and C1, are they? They're understandable. These adjectives are very similar in Portuguese, aren't they? And in Spanish, and in French, and in Italian, and in Romanian. In other words, the problem with global scales is they don't take into account local context. In other words, if you have a book, you have some material which is a B2 level, and the person goes to the editor goes to the scale and says, oh, these are all adjectives, I'm going to put them as the target vocabulary for C1. You show them to your students go, we too fast. This is not C1. In other words, the problem with global scales, we want to categorize in globally because that has more impact, but we forget the local context. So that's just a short parenthesis on language. But of course, we also try to categorize ourselves, don't we, all the time? Not just what type of learner, but what type of teacher. And you'll find people on Facebook doing this as well. And there was a very interesting debate. Those people, some of you may know this, TEFL Equity Advocates, fantastic initiative, which is fighting precisely against this stigmatizing label of non-native. And they're doing wonderful things for creating equal employment opportunities for native and non-native English speakers. You may well know, you familiar with this website? You should have a look at it. If you're not familiar with it, take a photo, make a note of it. The TEFL Equity Advocates are doing a fantastic job. But there was a very interesting debate recently on this website, which said, what is the minimum proficiency level for a teacher? And look, of course, we have to return to our labels that we use for learners. What should be the minimum proficiency level for a teacher? B2 or C1? Well, again, where are these levels coming from? These are levels from the Common European Framework. The Common European Framework uses the native speaker model, right? C2 is native speaker. In other words, there was a huge debate about this, and I'm not going to go into it now, but surely there is more to being an English teacher than just the level of your English, right? It's your knowledge of the language, yes, it's your proficiency in the language, yes, but it's also your ability to teach the language, right? Which is why we know that a lot of native speakers get off the plane, arrive in Porto or Lisbon or whatever, and can't, they have C2 native speaker level of English, but they can't teach anything. In other words, it seems to me they're falling into the same trap. Do you really believe that the minimum proficiency level for a teacher in the world is B2 or C1? Yeah, in Portugal, it might be. In Poland, it might be. But what about in Mexico? Imagine someone in Mexico looking at this. The minimum proficiency for an English teacher in Mexico, I can tell you, is not B2 or C1. It's much lower. And we can argue about whether that's good or bad or whatever, but that's a fact. In other words, to just use these terms in this way, it seems to me counterproductive. You are the level that you are in the context in which you're at. And there's more to it than just using the same categories. It's more complex than that, than just using the same categories that we use for our learners. But anyway, I'll debate that in the coffee break. I'm sure there'll be some people who disagree with me. Think about it and reflect on it. It's an interesting one. So, to get onto the positive, what we've been looking at is classification, labeling. And labeling is working from a model. It's what we call a paradigmatic approach, a paradigm. It's a general theory or method that we use to classify, to label, to categorize. It's a formal system, and it's designed for efficiency. Of course, we can't live without labels. And I have been very critical of the Common European Framework labels, because I don't like labels. But clearly, A1, A2, B1, B1+, it's much better than it used to be in the old days when we just had pre-intermediate. Remember, in Granada? We are able now to classify learners in a more rigorous way, in a more efficient way, thanks to the Common European Framework. The problem is the Common European Framework is being hijacked by others for their own uses, for other uses. Common European Framework is good news because it focuses on what you can do with the language, not what you know about the language. It's good. It's a good system. It's a good labeling system. But it is just a labeling system. And we all know that each student is individual, and this is the best we can do, but it's not quite enough. In other words, that's the paradigmatic, and the other alternative is the narrative. More detailed, specific. Remember that story about Sam? You need time to unpack that. You need to know about the student, about their background, and so on. Involves human action, emotion, and intent. So can you see, I think there's an affective thing going on here, yeah? That it would seem to me that this is an affective focus, where you're focusing on the emotional aspect, whereas the paradigmatic is the effective focus, the need for a method that's going to work. I have a method, it's going to work, it's going to be efficient, and of course we can't live without the paradigmatic. But what I would suggest is we need a bit of a mixture of two, and I'm going to look now a little bit more, in a little bit more detail, at the narrative as an alternative to the paradigmatic. And this is not me, this comes from Brunner. At the end of this talk, I'll share with you my website details. You can download a abridged version of this talk, and you can download a handout with the bibliography. But this is Brunner's definition, paradigmatic and narrative. I'm not the only crazy person interested in this. There's a book published by Cambridge called Learner's Stories, edited by Benson and Noonan, looking at difference and diversity in language learning, listening to learners' stories, somebody like Sam, for example. Narrative Inquiry in Language Teaching, Learning Research, another excellent book by Routledge. These are quite heavy books, though, so not, but they've got some interesting points of view in there. Also, if you go to my website, you'll find on a handout the whole story of Erick. I was working in Mexico recently for Cambridge. I'm not going to tell you his whole story now, but he is one of the reps for Cambridge University Press in Mexico. And he told me this incredibly moving story of how he left Mexico at 13 and crossed over the border into the United States illegally. You can read the whole story on the handout, okay, that you'll be able to download if you go to my website. And it's incredibly we're traveling from Mexico City to Puebla, which is south of Mexico City. He told me half the story in Spanish, and on the way back he told me the rest of the story in English. He's completely bilingual because he left just at the right time. But he told me that he was a complete misfit. When he came back to Mexico, when he went to the United States, they all laughed at him. They categorized him as a Latino. They associated him with drug culture. He had a terrible time. He was living in Idaho, where there were very few Latinos. It was, I was like astonished with this story. And then he returned to Mexico with this really strong American accent. And he was called a pocho. And he talked again about he couldn't fit in. He doesn't know who he is because of these negative labels. So that's a narrative approach. And I think there must be a lot of people like Erick in the world. A lot of people, a lot more people than we think. But I'm going to finish by telling you a story which was very moving, and I think does reflect some of the things that I'm talking about, the power of narrative over the power of paradigm. One day, I was just sitting at home, working, and I get a WhatsApp. And this is the WhatsApp, okay? My telephone pings, and says, oh, WhatsApp, it's going to be someone, my mother or something. And I didn't know who it was at the beginning. I saw this, it's the cover of a book that I've written. It's called Eyes Open in Portugal, but in Spain it's called Smart Planet. It's a book for secondary school, okay, secondary school. And at first of all, I didn't know who it was. This person, Enrique, I had his phone number, I think from the days that mobile phones started, 20 years ago. I hadn't been in contact with him for 20 years. But he had been a student of mine in the Centro de Lenguas Modernas, okay, of the University of Granada. And he had kept my mobile number, and he said, if I have to choose my course book by just looking at the author's names, you know what he's trying to say? It's been so long, congrats Ben, good jobs. In other words, it turns out that he is a secondary school teacher in Granada. He was my student, he is now a teacher. I worked out that it was Enrique. Great to hear from you. It's been a long time. Where are you working? I was very interested. I remembered him. I remembered that he'd been in my class many, many years. And he was very, very a conscientious student. So I asked him to write. I said, what have you been doing for the last 20 years? Tell me what you've been doing. So he wrote me. I was thinking he was going to say something, quite throwaway, like a WhatsApp. He said, no, I'm going to send you an email about this. So he sent me this email, and I'm going to read it to you because I think it says so much about our profession and the difference we make sometimes without realizing it. It's a little bit long, but we have 12 minutes, 56 seconds, so I think we'll be able to get through it. So just bear with me and listen to the story. In the last 18 months, my life has been like a roller coaster. Trying to change things in my working place has had a price to pay. But teaching and running have kept me alive throughout these hard times. Now you ask me to have a glimpse back into the times when I was learning to live my life. And it was all about dreams, goals, and pure excitement. So I must thank you. It sounds a kind of relieving therapy to me. So this is where I was starting to think, oh my God, I'm going to get emotional here. What's he going to say? He says, I started to learn English for a simple reason. I didn't want to use a dictionary to understand Bruce Springsteen's lyric. I made up my mind to study English at college, but I didn't just want to study the old way. This is where it starts getting interesting. So I chose the CLM, the Centro de Lenguas Modernas, in Granada, where you could learn real English with people whose commitment was far beyond mere teaching. A lot of conversation. This is his way of explaining. Music and video, different class management and atmosphere. this is what he's saying was new about, and I suppose what he was saying was new about the way I taught him, or the way he was, how he felt in class. I really enjoyed that way of learning English, which is something that somehow I tried to put into my teaching practice myself. Yes, I eventually became an English teacher. So this is where I start, oh no, Enrique, don't do this to me. It doesn't stop there. To sum up, I have been an English teacher for 19 years. I must admit that I'm going through difficult times because not everybody understands teaching in the same way. Remember, I was teaching in a very elite institution, university students, yeah? Or not in a secondary school, in a problematic barrio in Granada. I believe in a different learning process where teenagers can feel fully motivated as individuals in a group work environment. The teacher is an assistant and the student the protagonist. So you want labels? Those are interesting labels, yeah? And by this point, I was thinking, I was like on the floor. And then there's another little catch to it, because it's not just teaching, he's also obsessed with running. And he says, apart from being a secondary school teacher, I love mountain running. A year ago, some people pushed me to put into words my running experiences, which are inevitably linked to teaching, too. Thus, La Sombra del Corredor was published, and I could share my particular running universe with a lot of people who are really giving me another valuable and unexpected lesson in my life, because men learn what they teach. So, I was incredibly moved by this, because it is really communicating something so true about what we do, and yet so rarely do we get to hear this perspective from a learner. It was only through sheer chance, through luck really, that Enrique got back in touch with me, purely because my book arrived in his teacher's room one afternoon. And yet it shows you something very powerful about a powerful aspect of narrative. Yeah? So he's telling this story, his story. He's also telling the story of how he moved from student to teacher, from learner to teacher, and how he's trying somehow to apply some of the things that he must have acquired or had developed inside him in my classes. And I think that is so true about our profession, as I said, that we get up every day, we go to work, we teach English, we do our best, and we hope our learners will improve and have a good time and share some wonderful experiences. But we don't really know the impact we're having until something like this happens. And that's a very powerful thing when it does. When you get to hear this, you realize that being a language teacher is so much more than just teaching the language. It's a truism, I know, a bit corny, but it's clearly true when you see this. And there is Enrique, if you want to see, there he is, and that's his book. And not only, he's not only a teacher like me, he also gives talks in public. There he is at a press conference for his book, La Sombra del Corredor. So I suddenly thought, he really has become someone a little bit like me. What does that image? I put label in Google Images, and I got all kinds of strange things, but I like this idea of us constantly kind of labeling ourselves. It's easy to say don't label yourself, but we do have a tendency to do that. And I think in the digital age, we do it more and more than ever before, because as I had these things I showed you at the beginning, these tests that we do to categorize ourselves, the digital age seems to like categorization, yeah? And these categories, and there is, as I said, often ulterior motives for these categories, which are not always beneficial ones for teachers. Well, it's easier said than done, but that's kind of what I believe. So a way forward, just to finish for our community, I would say be critical of labels that sell us something new or necessary. Global scales that are trying to measure proficiency in ways which may be of interest to the person or people or industry that created the label, but may not be beneficial for ourselves. And not just talking about labels of language, also things that we should be incorporating into our classes. 21st century skills. I'm very skeptical that any of these skills are actually particularly new. They're just, the context is new, but the skills, I think, are very similar to the ones we've always wanted to develop in our learners. And yet they are pushed onto us as something that we have to adopt. Be critical of those labels. Yeah? Evaluate those labels, because very often they're kind of deceptive. Focus on those categories that do introduce important concepts. That concept, user-speak, user-learner, I think is a very useful one. And a way forward for our learners, listen to their stories if possible, not their supposed styles. Now learning styles has been debunked, thank God. And now it would be multiple intelligences and all the other ones that have been forced upon our profession with no academic rigor whatsoever. English language teaching is full of this kind of fake science, bad science. And luckily, this is now being pushed away. And I liked very much Ana Perez's talk yesterday because she focused on connections. You know, by listening to stories doesn't mean that we are differentiating people. No, listening to people's stories, listening to their narratives is, oh yeah, I'm like that as well. Finding connections between people's stories. We haven't got the time to differentiate between our learners. We've got 30 learners in class. We haven't got time to say, oh, he's visual, she's introvert. Let's focus on what we have in common. Let's focus on the connections that we have. The connections in class, the connections with the community, the connections with the teacher. I think that's the way to go. And a way forward for us as teachers, resist self-categorization if possible, if you can. And maybe this is the best advice. Remember and retell your story as a learner. Because that's what Enrique is doing in that little anecdote, isn't it? He is kind of, by that narrative, he was kind of telling his story the way he learned to be a teacher. Was in my classes. Yeah? And I think that's important, remembering and retelling your story as a learner, because that will help you in your teaching. It will help you very much feel an affinity, a greater affinity with your learners. If you can put yourself in their shoes, if you can imagine yourself in their context. Remember, I began an hour ago almost talking about the Bel Granadino, yeah, present perfect. I remember I said I had problems with misfits. You know, I had a student in 1992 who was really fluent, but didn't do the grammar test very well, didn't seem to know the difference between the present perfect. But imagine how many misfits there are now compared to 1992. Far, far more because of globalization. There are going to be far more. Every time you start a new course in September or October and you do your level test, you're going to have far more students who don't fit into neat categories. That will force you to listen to them as people, the affective, not the effective. And that, I think, is the truth of the world today. Far more people who don't fit into those neat categories that we so insist that they fit into. And one more quotation to finish, and this is a lovely one. Knowing yourself as a learner is not achieved by categorizing yourself according to someone else's paradigm. It's achieved by remembering, telling, and discussing stories of yourself as a learner. Thank you very much. I should say, yeah, that's the website. That's the dog that Andrea was talking about. That's the website you can go to, bengoldstein.es. You can go there. You click on this icon. On the left, you can find the talk and download the handout. I have another talk starting in 5 minutes. So I've got to go there. Thank you.